Hello, I am Dr. Taryn Myers from Virginia Wesleyan University, and I'm here to talk to you about a project that I collaborated on with Kelly Romano and Dr. Kristen Herron of the Virginia Consortium in Clinical Psychology and Old Dominion University. So the topic of our project is, does being a feminist matter? Examining the roles of feminist attitudes and identification in the relationship between sociocultural pressures and appearance concerns. I'd like to begin with a brief land acknowledgement. I am recording this from Virginia Beach, Virginia, which is the ancestral land of the Chesapeake and Lumbee people, and it was part of the Powhatan Paramount chieftain. So the first thing I'm going to talk about here is media influence. So why do we care about talking about the media? Well, in 2020, the average person spent approximately somewhere around 4 hours per day watching some sort of time-shifted live or streaming TV, close to 4 hours a day on their mobile device, 2.4 hours per day on social media in particular, and 2.6 hours per day online on their laptop or desktop. And we know that media use predicts many potentially detrimental things. So gender role endorsement and eating pathology, drive for thinness, body dissatisfaction, and eating disorder symptomatology, as well as thin ideal internalization, body dissatisfaction, and eating behaviors that are disordered. And this is why, right? When we turn on the media or we click on the media, right? This is what we see. We see these magazine covers now that we can go back into stores, right? At the grocery aisles. We see these banner ads to lose weight. We see the results of reality shows like The Biggest Loser. We see the representations of women in Disney where all of their waists are, I think, smaller than the circumference of their heads. Just kind of like ponder that for a second, right? And then even on shows that purport to be progressive, like Modern Family, the women are portrayed as the thin ideal, just variations on that, whereas the men are allowed more body size diversity. However, that does not mean that all media is accepting. For men run into a lot of the same issues we do as women. And so you can see various representations of just sort of ripped people. We know that folks like Hugh Jackman, for example, when they prepare for these roles, have to do extensive training, extensive dieting, right? So the idea that everyone could just do that is unrealistic. Ideas that you're going to lose like a man or you need a particular supplement to take. And again, Biggest Loser, Disney princes not looking that dissimilar in their body shapes as well. So, and this is not even to mention non-binary individuals, trans individuals, people who don't fit these two categories, who often aren't portrayed in the movies or maybe portrayed in various stereotypical ways. Now, appearance ideal internalization becomes a really big piece of this. So we know that women assimilate the unattainable thin ideal and its values. And for men, and really for women increasingly as well, the ideal is also muscular. So not only do you have to be slender, but you also got to have some tone, right? And this is really central to body image disturbance and appearance concerns because it may mediate the relationship between sociocultural pressures like those from the media and body dissatisfaction. So body image disturbance is a big key here. And I know I'm sort of preaching to the choir here, but I'm going to go ahead and give you my working definitions here. So body image disturbance is maladaptive cognitions, affect, and behaviors related to your body. Body dissatisfaction consists of those dysfunctional negative beliefs and feelings about your weight and shape. Body checking is one example of a behavioral component of body image disturbing. So obsessively checking areas of your body. These things are also sometimes conceptualized as appearance concerns. As we know, there are a whole host of terms that sort of end up being synonyms in some ways and not others for this category. We know that Silberstein, Striegel, Moore, and Rubin back in 1987 labeled this as a normative discontent because it's just so common, particularly among women in the Western world. And we know that over 80% of women in college settings report at least some body dissatisfaction, and that college men also experience this body dissatisfaction, and in particular, muscle dysmorphia. We know there are negative psychological consequences of body image disturbance: depression, social anxiety, sexual dysfunction. In men in particular, we see anabolic steroid use and all of its related health risks, and then eating psychopathology and its major health risks. And body image disturbance is considered a major risk factor for eating psychopathology. So you may be wondering, how do feminist beliefs and attitudes come into play here? Well, when I was in graduate school, I started playing around with the idea that, maybe feminist beliefs could be protective against some of this. And so previous findings have shown that there is a negative relationship between endorsement of feminist attitudes and concern about your weight. Feminist women have lower levels of judgment of other women's bodies. And feminism can provide an alternate way to understand cultural messages and reframe negative thoughts, as quoted from the Rubin piece from 2004. However, another thing they picked up on here is that these self-identified feminist women would say, I know I'm not supposed to feel this way about my body, that I'm not supposed to care, but I still do. And that's really what started my own line of research, where I started to look at, how do feminist beliefs come into play quantitatively? And I found that they seem to serve a buffering effect, but it's not a perfect protective, you're not going to experience any of it effect. So some other previous research in this area has had some issues. So we do find that college students are generally egalitarian in their gender attitudes. That's great, but they're very reluctant to self-identify as feminist. And that's really problematic for a whole bunch of reasons, socially, politically, right? But in particular, because self-labeling as feminist is linked to a whole host of positive psychological factors and to behaviors like feminist activism. There's a huge notable limitation to all of this previous research, my own included, is that the samples have been largely Caucasian and just haven't addressed potential race differences. Another thing we need to consider as we think about media images and how feminism might help us is that feminism, part of what it does is teach us media literacy, right? Media criticism. And so we have this awareness of the sociocultural pressures to conform to the thin ideal presented by the media, and that might actually increase subsequent appearance concerns. And that might be sort of hard to wrap your head around for the minute, but we are drawing attention to these images even in our critique of them, right? And we know from mountains of previous research that media exposure in and of itself is a high risk for all of these other factors, right? So maybe by drawing attention to them, it may be problematic. And there is some literature to perhaps back this up, coming from research around adding disclaimer labels to Photoshopped images. And what these studies have found is that this actually calls attention to these altered portions of the images rather than mitigating their effects. I mean, one of my favorite studies they did with this is eye tracking. And once people had read the disclaimer, they immediately looked at that part of the person's body. So the question here becomes, does increased attention to media, even with a critical lens, lead to thin ideal internalization and subsequently these appearance concerns? So our method here, we have over 1,000 undergraduates from 3 Mid-Atlantic universities. One was an R1, one was an HBCU, and then I'm at a small liberal arts institution. As you can see, our gender split isn't perfect, but this is certainly more men than we typically see in these types of studies. And our racial split was actually pretty great here. We did have folks of other ethnicities. However, we didn't have large enough samples to be powered to make these comparisons. So looking just at our white and black subjects. Mean age was about 22, and they completed these in an online survey format. So the measures they completed here, demographics, these included questions about feminist self-identification and also egalitarian attitudes. So we asked essentially, do you believe in the socio-political and economic equality between the sexes? And over 95% of participants said yes to that. But only 41% identified as feminist. And that really says we need a lot more education around what is feminism, right? Because that egalitarian item is just the definition of feminism, right? We included Morgan's liberal feminist attitudes and ideology scale. We included the fourth version of the SATAC, which has subscales measuring pressures from the media as well as appearance ideal internalization. And then we used the eating disorder examination-questionnaire, the subscales measuring shape concerns and weight concerns as our measure of appearance concerns or body image disturbance. So for our results, we looked first at replicating my previous findings with feminist beliefs as a moderator, sort of that buffering effect. What we found is that media pressure significantly predicted weight and shape concerns, but feminist attitudes did not moderate this relationship. So then I sort of started playing around with these ideas from the Burry and Tigeman group about if we're drawing attention to the media, could that actually be problematic in and of itself? And so I looked at the relationship between feminism and shape concerns and whether the media pressures might actually explain this in a mediational model. So using process model 4, we found that there was a significant total effect for shape concerns, and there seemed to be this direct effect of feminist attitudes on shape concerns. And so that becomes mind-boggling, right? Like, why are the people who are more feminist more concerned about their shape? Well, when we look at the indirect effect, that direct effect disappears and becomes non-significant. So it's really explained by this higher level of media pressures that women who have these higher levels of feminist attitudes are experiencing. And we found very similar comparable results for weight concerns, where it looked like feminism is predicting weight concerns, but in fact, once you take media pressures into account, that is no longer a direct effect. Back in the day, we used to call this complete mediation, right? Those terms aren't really used anymore, according to Hayes. But certainly you can kind of wrap your head around that if you're familiar with that concept. I also played with some moderated mediations to look at, are there gender differences? Are there racial differences? Are there differences based on feminist self-identification? If they answered yes to that yes, no question. The mediational association held for women, but not for men. And the conditional effect of feminist attitudes on shape concerns was significant for people who did not identify as feminists, but not for those who identify as feminists, which makes intuitive sense, right? If we think about, especially Yoder's group, all of the research they've found about how feminist beliefs are protective. However, the main effects were not significant for those. So one can argue we perhaps shouldn't interpret these at all, or at the very least, they should be interpreted with caution. So what does this all mean? Well, feminist beliefs do actually appear to increase attention to media images, which statistically explains that relationship. And we really expanded prior research in that we did have this more gender and ethnically diverse sample, although certainly room to grow there as well. So why are we finding this pattern? So as I mentioned before, feminist attitudes and belief teach us to be critical of the media, and that's going to increase our attention to the media. And previous research shows over and over that higher levels of thin ideal internalization and body image disturbance happen at higher levels of media exposure or pressures, regardless of whether or not you're feminist. And previous research shows, again, that drawing attention to elements of a media image to critique it still leads to those negative consequences. So how should we address this in future research? How should we address this in interventions? So we really need to think about combining media literacy with awareness of the negative consequences of media exposure and pressures. Again, feminist women still feel bad about themselves even when they are at these higher levels, of media consumption. We do see more of a protective effect if they're not taking in media as much. We need to continue to examine this in diverse samples and to think about it in terms of diverse media representation as well, or the lack thereof. And we might need to think about reworking prevention programs and interventions. So for example, the Body Project with its element of cognitive dissonance and sort of challenging your own image by doing things like mirror exposure, right? And having to write good things about your body, which is really hard. It's sad how hard it is, right? Because we're just not used to doing that, hence the cognitive dissonance. It does include an element of media critique, but in this context. So this might be a really nice model for prevention programs going forward. Plus, the work of Becker and Stice really showed that this is empirically validated in a whole host of settings and works really well and has lasting effects. So I'd like to just briefly say thanks to my co-collaborators and to my institution, and especially to Old Dominion, which provided us with a small internal grant for this research. My contact information for both email and Twitter are here. And I look forward to answering your questions in the Q&A live portion.